Okay, my name is Joe Vanderbilt. I'm the president of the Space Coast chapter of INCOSE, International Council on Systems Engineering. So this is our February meeting, and it is a joint meeting that includes the ITEA, International Test and Evaluation Association, the Central 4 chapter. Okay, so with that, we will move into tonight's presentation. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth to introduce our speaker. And I guess we got to do some slide rearranging here.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, David. It is with great pleasure that I get to introduce tonight's speaker, David Goertz. He is the director of the U.S. Strategic Perspective Institute. He is an author, U.S. policy advisor, computer scientist, and one of America's foremost cybersecurity experts. He's going to talk tonight about security concerns of Android mobile devices. We appreciate his time here tonight to present on this topic. David lives here in Brevard County with his wife, Denise, in Palm Bay. And so please welcome David Goertz.
You want to flip your own slides?
That'd be great.
It's just forward and backward with the arrows. There's also a laser pointer.
Fabulous. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Since today is Groundhog Day, you've all heard me already, and I've done this, so thank you very much. What I'm here to talk to you about is Android security. These little pocket full. And before I get started, I want to point out something I was thinking as all this is going. There have been a lot of people working on bringing this presentation to you, not only here in this room, but the folks up in Orlando and the people who are simulcasting this all over, as well as a bunch of people on entire crews of broadcast engines to be able to do communications and then across the country. Amazing that technology and these little tiny computers, little tiny cameras and so forth are able to take this information and send it out everywhere. And so the point of this is to remember the technology I'm talking about is not only new and unusual and different, but it's changing everything. And so that's where I'm going to go. But first I want to thank a lot of people, because an awful lot of folks had an awful lot of effort to bring this whole thing together. I want to call out to Elizabeth and Sam and David and Joe, the folks at is it INCOSE?
INCOSE.
INCOSE Orlando, the UCF Business Incubation Program, and thanks to the folks at the church for letting us have this great venue. I also want you to let you know that there's a team of experts I work with called the Internet Press Guild, and these are the people you read whenever you're reading technical documentation and magazines about what's going on in the technical industry, whether when you're on Z World or any of those sorts of things. The Internet Press Guild are the folks who are making that happen. And when I was telling them that I was taking a deep dive into Android security, I asked them for their insight. I asked them for a perspective of the future of where this is going. I asked them to help me give you some tips, both for personal folks as well as for the enterprise world. And so they participated as well. I also want to thank T-Mobile and Dell, because I had a chance to do some very, very in-depth interviews with them, and I'll give you the link so you can watch those, about how Android is being used in a hardened military environment and why that's important. And then finally, you're going to get some very interesting statistics from the U.S. Secret Service, and a big shout out to them for being able to provide that as well. Just a slight slide presentation tip. I tend to like putting the thank yous in the front, because by the end everybody's a little tired, and I want to make sure everybody hears the thank yous for everybody who participated in this stuff. So, what you're going to learn, there we go. Apparently we're doing it slide by slide. Why Android matters so much. This is very important. The next is understanding the security threat, 10 tips for staying safe, and a look at Android's future. Now I'm going to go into each of these, and there are going to be a couple points where I'm going to stop for questions, which is going to be my excuse to have an extra sip of water, but also give you guys a little bit of input. And then at the end, as many questions as we need to, we can take. But this is the key slide, and I really want you guys to look at this. First of all, I love charts. So the election season to me is great because I get to see chart after chart and they animate and they're all really cool. But I want to point out this chart, and I know this has a pointer, but I'm going to describe it so because not everybody can see this remotely. If you look at the very big box on the right, which says PC, Android, iPhone, iPad, that's actually the little teeny box in the corner. And that goes all the way back, if you follow the chart, all the way back to 1975, which is basically the early days of the PC. And if you look at the growth rate of the PC, from 1975 to 2011, we're looking at the growth rate of the PC, but Android, faster than iPhone and further than iPhone, faster than iPad, faster than Macintosh, faster than the PC. Android has gone, in the period of time from this little dotted line over here, in the middle of 2009, all the way up to just about the total PC market share penetration in 2 years. This is why Android matters. Because Android is taking over the world in terms of computing technology. Far more than anything else. I mean, it's not just a phone. You're talking about a penetration that is close to the PC. In the space of 2 years, we're talking about exceeding, if you follow that chart, it's going to exceed the PC in a year or so. You're going to have these little tiny pockets full of functionality, capability, and nightmares all across the world, following people wherever they go, everywhere. And that's what's going to be really interesting, but also really challenging. And so that's why we're talking about Android. It's also why we're talking about problems with Android. And it's important to realize, I mean, we're looking at, in the space of 6 months, over 1 million users infected with viruses and malware. How you protect yourselves and your families, how you can integrate them into your overall how to live comfortably with these things that essentially, 20 or 30 milliseconds away from nation states who are trying to penetrate your secrets, penetrate your bank accounts, criminals who want to take your medical records, just 20 to 30 seconds away from this little device. Go for this, and the glasses for water. So, I think you can figure out this chart. This is 2010. This is projected to 2014. This is the estimated mobile value of mobile transactions changing in the course of 4 years. You are looking at hundreds of billions of dollars. Now, hundreds of billions of dollars is an enormous motivation for everything, in particular international crime. So when you have $100 billion worth of, $630 billion of motivation, and that's going to increase. I suspect if we take a measurement of this at the end of this year or the beginning of 2013, that number will be over $1 trillion because of the growth rate of these phones is actually more of a hockey stick than a straight up and down line. So we've also seen the likelihood of encountering malware on these devices increased by 250% in 6 months. That's 6 months. That's 250%. That's if there was one person who was going to encounter it, then 6 months later there'd be 2.5 people. Or if there were 10 people, next month everybody in this room would have a malware infection. That's a big growth of the kind of likelihood of hitting this stuff in a very short period of time. Again, remember that these are the most personal devices and the smartest devices that anybody has had in human history to be able to carry with them. It carries your bank account, it carries your location information, it carries all of the information about people who you may or may not be in contact with, it has home addresses. It's not just for little Johnny who wants to text his girlfriend, but it's also for people like the White House Chief of Staff who might have information about the home addresses for Supreme Court justices and things like that. It's detailed, important, often mission-critical information that we don't want to get out into the wild. There we go. Okay. So this, I'm going to build this pretty quick. Then I'll go back, because there we go. So there's a lot of motives for cyber attack. I mean, there's an awful lot of motives. Whether or not you're looking at breaking something, and by breaking something, I'm talking about not just the teenager down the street, although, to be fair, teenagers down the street are an interesting risk. I've talked to a lot of national security experts who categorize teenagers as their own threat vector, because they have the time, they have the motivation, they have the machines. You know, a PS3 with Linux on it is one hell of a powerful computer. And so, but it's also because of distributed denial of service attacks. Do you disapprove of an entity? Let's take them down. Do you disapprove of something they're doing? Do you want your competitor to not be able to function for some period of time? Do you want to send a message? Do you want to test the defenses of another country? Do you want to see whether or not you can get into their infrastructure? Do you want to see if you can take down their electrical system? All of these sorts of things happen with a denial of service attack. Now, if you're not familiar with a denial of service attack, what I'd like you to think of is take all the people in this room. There's about 30 people in this room, and imagine that all of you weren't thrilled with me. So all of you were taking an apple or a banana, and you decided all at once to throw it at me. Now, one of you I could probably catch it. Two of you I could probably catch it. Maybe even three, because I'm pretty good. But if 30 are coming, it's going to hurt. Now, take that and multiply it. Multiply it not by 10 or 100. Multiply that out by 1,000,000. Imagine 1,000,000 computers, or 1,000,000 of these, because these things are now as powerful as the computers we had 4 or 5 years ago. Imagine 1,000,000 of these things all pointed at one web server and shooting packets at that web server, one after the other. And imagine it's constant. That web server cannot withstand those kinds of attacks. I had a little photo site a couple years ago called Connected Photographer that actually sustained one of these denial of service attacks, and I'll tell you why in a sec. But what happened was one day I got up and the web server was down. I'm trying to figure out why. And all of a sudden I find that there's a truck coming into this web server. Just an absolute tremendous amount of traffic. I managed to start tracing it. We put in some mitigation tools, and we found that we were getting 10,000 hits a second, just pummeling on the server. Now Connected Photographer is a photo site. It teaches you how to mount your pictures and stuff. It's not particularly exciting. But we were getting 10,000 of these things a second. And they were coming from all over the world. They were coming from Belarus and China and Cincinnati and Australia and Russia and the UK. They were coming from everywhere, all coming into the site at once. And it happened for 3 full days until we finally were able to mitigate the attack. What were they doing? We had an email, little tiny button that says, email this page to a friend, where you type in a little message. What they were doing was they were piggybacking spam onto that page. Millions of computers all across the world were injecting their spam message into this page and then retransmitting that spam message using that page as their spam transmittal service. And that was one small website. That's what a denial of service attack can do. Now, again, for us, it was a bad 3 days of my life. It was not something critical. But imagine that kind of firepower. And if you talk about people like the Anonymous group, who talks about low Earth ion cannons, they aim that firepower at a target they dislike. Imagine that kind of firepower aimed at, let's say, a local medical facility or an electrical facility or something like that. That's enormous. But what's been happening, the change, is that these DDoS bots, the little tiny agent that runs on the computers, used to live on laptops. They now live on these things. So now everybody walking around, and remember that's mobile, so not only were we able to beginning to track IP addresses of where they originate, but once you start to move around, these things are connecting to different places and different locations and moving. So now you have, basically attack vectors that are mobile, constantly moving at the same time, coming from dual and quad-core processor devices with a 4G network connection that could come from anywhere in the world and move. So that's your denial of service attack. The same idea is the co-opting of the system, whether you're taking it over for the purpose of creating a denial of service attack or whether you're taking it over because you want to pummel into something and get access to things. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. Other reasons is because you want to steal something. We talked about a $630 billion market for transactions. Stealing something becomes really attractive when you have 630 billion reasons to do so. Cause something to give wrong information. Now, why would you want to give wrong information? Let's take an interview that I did recently with Argonne National Laboratories, where the scientists at Argonne National Laboratories found a flaw in voting machines, where the voting machines would give wrong information. So here is a very classic example of what could go wrong is if you can alter a device to give you the wrong kind of information, you have some serious implications, especially if you're talking about elections, or you're talking about the speed of a vehicle, or you're talking about heart rates in a hospital, or you're talking about the amount of current you release into the system. Wrong information can have a severe effect. I mean, you guys are the system engineers and test engineers. You understand what happens when you have wrong information and the disaster that can come from that. Changing the expected behavior of a system is similar to wrong information, because once you have wrong information, you can change the behavior of a system. We recently looked at a variety of research into car systems and whether car systems, the little computers in the cars, were vulnerable to attack. And although they're still relatively well hardened, because of the Bluetooth interfaces that are coming into cars at this point, there is now a pathway into car engines and into car computers that one or two steps away could allow us to do things like tell the engine is going at the wrong speed, then cause the behavior of the engine to change. So, for example, if you think you're pushing down the brake, it would then, because these are all drive-by-wire, it would then move the car faster. This stuff can be very dangerous. I mean, it sounds science fiction-y, but it can be true. And then there's just for the kick of it, just because it could be fun. So there's a lot of this stuff going on. Let's take us to the next slide here. So what can they do to you? They can do really bad things to you. They can stick a bot on your phone. They can log your email and texts, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. The worst thing that they can do is they can use your resources to commit crimes that are then traced back to you, and that can ruin your life. They can take your money from you. They can ruin your identity. They can remove your ability to gain access to medical care. There's a lot of badness that can happen through some of these things. And it sounds, by the way, this stuff sounds paranoid. I mean, sometimes when I give these threat lectures, I'm like, oh my God, you're a paranoid man. And then I read the reports of what some people have gone through, and I read the stories of what's happened to some people. And I talk to law enforcement and Homeland Security folks and folks in the military, and I'm like, whoa, this stuff is real. And so, fortunately, the Android market is the Android size of the Android. The penetration of Android into the market is relatively high, but we've seen at least 1 million in 6 months already experiencing some of this behavior. So, 1 in 3 users have experienced a web-based threat in 2011. That means that they found some kind of threat loaded onto their device because they went somewhere in Chrome on the phone. Let's talk about smartphone bugging software, and after this section I'm going to bring you guys in and let you shoot a few questions out. There are more than one piece of software about this, but I was introduced to one of these packages by a couple of special agents in the FBI who are trying to deal with this problem. There is a commercial piece of software, which I'm not going to name or tell you how to get to, that ranges in price from about $39.95 to $395. It can be ordered from a foreign nation on the web. So you go to a little website, you type it in, you give them their credit card, they give you the software. That basically turns this into a bug. You are warned today that whatever you say here can be heard elsewhere, so no secrets or anything else that you don't want to pass along to the world. Well, the thing is that you can turn one of these things into an active bugging device, so that whatever is being said near this device can be rebroadcast. Now, I'm a boring dude, so when I say something near the device, it's going to sound either like this or I'll be talking about Star Trek. I mean, nobody wants to hear that. But imagine that this is carried by somebody walking into the Oval Office. Or imagine this is being carried by somebody walking into an engineering meeting and it's been bugged by one of their competitors. Or any of the other, use your Tom Clancy imagination for what could go wrong if people could hear this thing that's sitting on their belt or in their pocket and hear the room around them. it becomes very interesting and very challenging. Now, this problem does not exist just for Android. In fact, Android is one of the latest clients to get this kind of threat. We became aware of this threat with BlackBerries. Back in 2008, the White House went down to a leadership conference in New Orleans, and they met with the and senior White House officials went into a conference room, and they were asked to please not bring their smartphones into the conference room. Actually, at the time, they were asked to please not bring their BlackBerries because they were all BlackBerry all the time at the time. They were asked to not bring their BlackBerries into a conference room, and so they were asked to put their BlackBerries in a box outside the conference room. So all the Canadian officials and all the American officials and all the Mexican officials took these things, I'm going to step out of the frame for just 1 second, folks, and just put it into a box outside the room. And then they went into their meeting. They came back later, and a bunch of the BlackBerries were missing. These are BlackBerries that are used by government officials to do government officially kinds of stuff. And they were missing. It turns out that they were stolen by a Mexican attaché, an actual Mexican diplomat working for the Mexican government. They were retrieved well over 20 minutes later. We don't know exactly how long because the Secret Service won't tell us. But we do know that where they were retrieved in the distance from the hotel says that they were in his hands for at least 20 minutes, which is more than enough time to install bugging software on it, and more than enough time for it to take effect before they were retrieved. So, if, for example, you ever lose one of these things and it's returned to you, wipe it to bare metal before you use it. Oh, by the way, that same software can be installed on Android, but if you want to install it on an iPhone, you need to root the iPhone. The iPhone has a different architecture, so it's a little bit harder to install this kind of stuff on an iPhone. And that's going to be a little bit of our theme as we move forward. So I talked about remote environment listening. That means that somebody can call the target phone and listen to anything that goes on. It won't ring. The phone won't ring. They'll just call the number using a special code. The phone will just turn on silently. The display won't go on, and it will become a recording device. They can also do the same thing for call listening so that they can tap into any phone calls being made. Any text messages being sent, any emails being sent, all that. And they can get recorded versions of these things so that they can review them later. This is real. This is something you can buy now for, I think if you want the recording effect, it's an extra $100. I mean, this is real. They advertise it as spy on your spouse kind of software. And that's their justification is, your spouse is cheating, you want to find out what's going on, don't hire a private detective, put this on their phone, blah, 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 blah. But, nefarious things can happen. Let's take it one more slide. So the other thing is that this stuff can be remote controlled as well. So you can reconfigure the phone remotely and decide what it does. Now, so one of the things is that all of a sudden you see your phone starting to lose battery power all of a sudden. You might want to consider whether or not your phone's been on doing this, unless, of course, you've got 4S and it's talking to Siri, in which case you're going to lose battery power anyway. But this is one that's really interesting. Let's assume you think you've been compromised. So you go and you say, I want a new phone number, and you replace the SIM card. Go and get the new SIM card, come back. What the system will do, because it's running in the background and hidden from view, it doesn't show up in the taskbar, it doesn't show up in the task manager anyway. What it'll do is it will phone back to the stalker and let them know, oh, the phone number has changed and here's the new SIM card code. All emails, all messages. And, tracking location with GPS is not necessarily a safe thing. So, before I move on to types of mobile threats and threat vectors, let's start with the first round of, do we have any questions before I move on?
I think Sam has a question.
Sam, go ahead.
What does LUTs mean? I'm sorry.
Lulz. Lulz is L-U-L-Z, or L-O-L-Z, depending on who is doing it. Lulz is kind of for the heck of it, for the fun of it, for the kicks. It's a hacker term that basically means we're going to prank you just because we can prank you. But sometimes that pranking is really bad pranking. In other words, it's not just I'm going to, make fun of your tie or tell you you're ugly and your mother dresses you funny. It's I'm going to ruin your life just because I can, and isn't that fun to do? So Lulz It's serious prankage, basically. Serious, nasty prankage. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
When you say take an Android device down to bare metal, how do you do that?
Well, okay, we don't really have time for that today, but essentially that is zeroing the device, reinstalling the operating system, doing a full hard reset on the device, those sorts of things. Usually each manufacturer has a different technique for doing that. You may actually, depending on how concerned you are, you may want to work with somebody who's an expert on being able to do that. But essentially, it's a full reinstall and a full reformat of your flash memory, everything that's in the system, so that you essentially root out anything that could possibly be like rootkitting or anything like that.
So if I took it back to the place I purchased it at, could they do that right there on the spot?
It depends on the place you purchased it. You know, some of the folks that, the question here is, how do I take an Android device down to bare metal? You know, it depends on where you purchased it. You know, whether they can do that for you. I mean, some of the technicians at these stores are really, really capable. Some of them are astonishingly incapable. So, you know, I would say that in this case, Google is your friend, and you want to start there. You know, and talk to the manufacturer themselves. But secondarily, you know, the store can at least reset it to factory settings for you, without a doubt. And that's at least getting you started. Yes, ma'am.
Then after you do that, if you kind of resync your information from your PC to your phone, is that a bad thing?
It depends on whether you think your PC backup has been compromised. Again, this is the sort of situation, and yes, I'm being asked to repeat the question. I am sorry. I have to keep remembering that. The question was, if you resync back to the Android phone after you've reset it to bare metal, is that a problem? And the answer to that is it could well be a problem if the infection has moved its way up into your existing data. It's like if you restore a disk image on a Windows machine that already has a virus and you bring that restore image back, you could conceivably bring that information back in. And if we have any other questions, I will try to remember to repeat it this time. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that the federal government has asked the makers of North Star to put a backdoor on North Star, so that even if you have North Star turned off in your car, OnStar?
OnStar.
Yeah.
Yeah, the question is whether the federal government has asked the makers of OnStar to be able to remotely turn it on, whether or not you've turned it off in your car. And the easy answer I could tell you is I can't tell you about that. But the more detailed answer is this moves into the question of privacy and government intervention, and it's not just an OnStar question, it's a question about a lot of these things. You know, I talked about the remote bugging from nefarious people or, you know, hackers trying to get into your stuff. I didn't talk about remote bugging from our government wanting to watch us, you know. And there's two sides of that. I mean, I work with the national security apparatus here in this country, and one of the things that we have to do, and I don't really do it nearly as much as they do, is defend against attack against the interests of America, you know, terrorist attacks and so on. And so on one hand, we're balancing this question of protecting our rights with protecting our citizenry, you know, and this is a question that America has struggled with forever. And some of these things, like whether or not we can turn on location sensing information with or without a court order, becomes a huge issue as we move forward into this digital world. And the problem, and speaking personally, and this isn't the view of any organization, speaking personally, the issue that we're finding is that a lot of the government, both both in Congress and in the individual states, wants to bypass due process to allow these privacy violations to happen without the oversight of a court. We have a system in this country that allows privacy violations to take place if it has been so approved by a judge. And it works. It's been around for a long time. And what we're seeing is a number of laws and a number of procedures are being put into place to try to bypass that court oversight. And I think that's wrong. I think it's perfectly necessary for a government to monitor its citizens in certain circumstances to protect the rest of its citizens, but not by bypassing their rights or bypassing their oversight to do that. And so that's where this issue becomes, and it's an epic struggle. I mean, this is not just OnStar and, you know, the federal government. This is a question of the future of American freedom in some degree, because what's happening is a lot of the courts and a lot of Congress don't think that the digital domain is the real world. So we can, using their terminology, we can violate the rights of the digital domain, and it's okay because it's not the real world. When so much of what we do is now transferring onto the digital world, whether it's our communications, whether it's our reading patterns, whether it's where we go, whether it's what, you know, how we communicate for work, all of that is being moved onto the digital world. So our rights on the digital world are just as necessary. And again, we have to practice that balance, that all-important balance between protecting our citizenry and protecting our freedoms. And one of the places we need to do is make sure there's judicial oversight on all of these laws. Yes, sir?
There was an important court case recently where they, the judge or the court or whoever, ruled that the government couldn't attach a GPS tracker
Yes,
device to a car.
there's been a big battle now. The question was, can there's been a court case about attaching a GPS device to a car without a court order. This is one of those sorts of situations. And it is an appeal, again, I believe. But, you know, certain aspects of law enforcement want the right to put a GPS on a car without getting a judge's approval. You know, you need a judge's approval to go in and look in somebody's house, and that's okay. We know that if you have a search warrant, you can go and look in somebody's house. That's the way it works. There's no reason to not do that with a GPS. But the premise was, and this is where it gets ludicrous to a certain degree, again, my opinion, is that because your car is operating in the public space, because it's driving on public roads, it has no assumption of privacy, and therefore it's okay to attach something onto your car to track you. And, you know, the courts ruled that this was in fact not the case, because you did have an assumption of not being followed all over the place in your private vehicle. And so, but we're fighting this. This is an ongoing fight between overzealous politicians in many cases, to some degree not aware politicians, and those of us who are technically inclined and understand what the implications of this are. And again, I'm going to continue this presentation in just a sec, but before I move on, after one question is asked, it's important to realize that, again, these law enforcement activities are essential because we did, in fact, get bombed. You know, we did drive by the World. I used to live in New Jersey, and we did drive by where the World Center once was, and we did smell the smoke. And in Princeton Junction, there were cars sitting in the parking lot that hadn't moved for months. We do get attacked, and we do need to make sure that we can protect ourselves. But we have to make sure we do it and remain America at the same time. Anyway, yes, sir.
We have a question from Orlando online. They're asking, what is it about the iPhone that creates that having to be jailbroken to install spy software where the other platforms do not?
The question is, what is it about the iPhone that means that it has to be jailbroken before that spy software is installed? And actually, I'm going to go into that in the architecture of the phones further in the presentation, so hang in there. I'm going to do that. In fact, I'm going to head into that right about now. So let's continue up with what we've got here. You've had this chart up for a while, so I don't have to read it to you. But essentially what we've got is a variety of different threats. This is basically mapping out the threat vectors in terms of what can get onto your phones. Now, a lot of this presentation is astonishingly the same, whether I'm talking about these things or whether I'm talking about laptops or desktops or anything else. So be aware that this kind of threat vector used to exist in the PC and Mac world, more in the PC world to some degree, in the Linux world and so forth, but in the big computer world, and is now sort of moving its way into the small computer world, but it is existing, and there's similar sorts of threats. So roughly speaking, when we're talking about application-based threats, we're talking about things that are based on applications that you install on the device. When we talk about physical threats, we're talking about threats to the physical device and to you. When we talk about network threats, we're talking about stuff coming in through the network and doing things to you. And when we talk about web-based threats, we're talking about stuff that's coming in through the web, through a web-based interface in some way, and getting to you that way. And roughly speaking, you know, the web-based threats is really things when you go to a website, something's installed when you go to the website, or when you open your email, something has a phishing attempt and it looks really like Bank of America, but it's not. And so you type in all your information and it's not Bank of America, and now somebody has your information. Browser exploits are another area of that. Network threats are pretty much things that travel over the network. You're all told to use network security when you connect to these things, because an open network connection means that you can be watched and all your information can be watched. That's what a network threat is. The app-based threats are new. We're starting to see more and more threats based on what's coming in on the apps you download. And this is another place where we're seeing worrisome security problems in the Android world. And I'll tell you about that in specific to Android in a minute. Physical threats are the ones that I'm pretty concerned about. I talked about the stolen devices from New Orleans for those White House meetings. You know, the other threat, of course, is I was suggested by one of my IPG members that I mentioned that one threat that can happen is you drop the thing, you drop it in the toilet, you break it, your phone breaks. It's a threat. But the other is this stalking and tracking thing. We Twitter and we Facebook and we Foursquare and we do all these weird things to tell everybody everything about us, where we're going to be at what time and what's going on. Now, the classic example I use is an executive at a very, very large Fortune 500 company. By very, very large, I mean a Fortune 10 company, who decided that he wanted to do social networking outreach. He travels internationally, and he has a young family. Wherever he goes, when he's going to travel, he tells people what gate he's going to be at, when he's going to be there, and what flight he's on. He tells people when he's leaving home. He told people where he bought his baby cart from. Now, you can imagine, I mean, for most people that's not quite an issue, but when you're talking about a senior executive at a major American company, and you look at things like kidnappings in South America have gone up at a tremendous rate, you're talking about creating a huge target of opportunity. Or when our teenage kids are out there telling people where they're at every single location, you create a stalking opportunity that's a little bit excessive. You know, so there's physical threats that come from these things as well. I don't have time in this thing to go into the depth of the physical threat, except, you know, to advise you and to advise you to advise your kids to not tell people where you're going to be all the time. You know, not tell them when you're leaving the home for 2 weeks. You know, not tell them when you're leaving the home for 2 weeks and your wife is going to be there alone, which is all things that people have done. Don't do that. All right, let's go on. Okay, so I wanted to use this. I'm not going to read all this stuff to you, but you guys can see it pretty well. The amount of data that these things hold is almost incomprehensible. And this is a 16 gig version. This one, which is an iPhone, is a 64 gig version. This thing can hold about 10 full DVDs worth of data. It can hold 40 times the amount of confidential information that Bradley Manning stole from WikiLeaks for the WikiLeaks theft from the State Department. It can hold 25,000 copies of the King James Bible. Now think about that in terms of, you know, file cabinets. You know, somebody who steals one of these things is, and if it's full with company information or confidential information and so forth, is driving up 10 18-wheelers to your building and lugging off file cabinets filled with all your information. You know, and you might get kind of nervous if all of a sudden you're at your corporate headquarters and 18-wheeler after 18-wheeler is coming in and people are coming in with hand trucks and they're taking the hand trucks and loading boxes on it and file cabinet after file cabinet is being drawn outside of the building. You would notice that. But if one of your executives loses his smartphone or it's stolen, the same or worse damage, because not only will the information be on here, but most likely there'll be a VPN connection, there'll be access to the corporate database, there'll be the ability to update the corporate database. A tremendous amount of information goes mobile now, and that's something to be aware of. Okay, so again, we're talking about January to June 2011 because we don't have much updated data yet for 2012 or the latter part of 2011. But in the early part of 2011, there was about 80 applications infected with malware. Now we're looking at upwards of 400. You know, in anybody's math, that's at least a 4 times increase in the number of applications. Now, admittedly, there are hundreds of thousands of applications out there, but even so, this is increasing incredibly fast. So I'm going to take you through one of the more interesting App Store threats that we have here. But before I do, Denise, are you around here somewhere? Could you find me a paper towel or a napkin? I sometimes get enthusiastic, so Oh, here we go. Thank you. Excuse me, folks, while I de-enthusiastic myself. There we go. I'm going to put that in my pocket because that's pretty nasty. Okay, so let's take a look at this chart. This is really interesting. Many people buy things from the App Store. Let's say you like Angry Birds. I don't know why. Angry Birds is a pox upon mankind. But let's say you like Angry Birds, okay? And so you decide that you want to download Angry Birds, and it's $10. So you're like, all right, well, I don't want to download Angry Birds for $10 from the Android market. I saw it on. So you decide to download it from the other market. But what happens is that might not be the Angry Birds you think, because what's happening is malware vendors are buying an original copy of the thing, downloading it from the App Store. They're then installing a payload into that application, re-uploading it to these secondary app stores, selling it containing malware. So if you're going to one of these secondary app stores and you buy this thing for $3, not only are you paying them to infect you, but the people you were intending to buy it from aren't getting it. And this is starting to be really prevalent. So the cautionary tale here is, first off, be extremely careful about any apps you install on the device at all. Make sure you understand the security threats and so forth. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But secondarily, avoid buying stuff for cheap at these secondary stores because most likely they're polluted with things designed to ruin your life. Gotta love people sometimes. All right, so I talked about botnets earlier, and I talked about the one that hit me. This is a billion-dollar business. These are some of the ways that botnets make money. They do it by the denial of service attacks. They actually sell the service of providing a denial of service attack. There's a group of people called botnet herders. Botnet herders are, for all intents and purposes, retailers who sell a service. And you can go to them and you can say, I would like you to take down this, or I would like you to attack that, and you pay them some money, and they bring up their network of remote computers and remote devices, and they attack the device, attack the target. Theft of confidential information, phishing, spam, search engine spam, adware, all that stuff. All of these are ways that they make money. So we're looking at, when we talk about the question of, is there a market here? Remember we talked about the transaction market being worth $650 billion or so. In addition, these things are worth billions of dollars. Why is this happening? Why is this a threat? Why is this something we need to pay attention to? Because people are making huge bucks off of it. That's why. And this is a chart. You guys can see this on the slides, but essentially you've got people who are renting a botnet, you've got people selling a botnet, you've got different markets. I mean, there is actually, you can do a distribution channel market, just like you would do an MBA school for anything else. You can do a distribution channel market for botnets. So this is from the Secret Service, and I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I'm going to run this by you just to give you a rough idea. There's all of these different businesses that come out of creating this kind of malware. It's a tremendous market. It's a big business, and it actually breaks down into job descriptions of all the different kinds of people who can do nastiness. You'll be able to see these in the slides afterwards, and I don't want to belabor the presentation with it right now, but just roughly you're talking about carders and spammers and botnet herders and money launderers and renegade hosters and malware developers and forgers and service providers. I mean, there's a whole range of ISPs out there who are providing ISP services to the bad guys. Fraudulent calling services. I mean, this stuff is a huge industry. I mean, this thing dwarfs our movie industry. It dwarfs many of the other industries we have just in doing this stuff. So, I talked about malware attacks. These, I'm going to actually sort of look at this to reference. But one of them, Droid Dream, hit 250 users in 2011. It basically installed a botnet node. I talked about the botnet nodes on here. Droid Dream did that. It connected to a remote server and accepted commands. So you turn on your phone and you're going to do something. Behind the scenes, Droid Dream was going out, connecting into their server and saying, what would you like me to do, master? At which point it would get some degree of instruction. Sometimes that was scurry around the phone and send me everything you can find. Sometimes it's listen for some information. Sometimes it's look for patterns of texts. What's in patterns of text? Credit card number information, bank account numbers, that sort of thing. GG Tracker was also interesting. This one was nasty because it targeted Americans specifically. It specifically went out and looked for American systems. And then, among other things, it would charge your phone bill $10 for the privilege of having it. So, these things are in the wild. There's different kinds of malware attacks. One of the things that's interesting to note is that things like Droid Dream exploited exploits in the system to be able to install on malware through apps and app downloads. The way that you can exploit the iPhone and the iPad has pretty much changed. So far, you can't really do this with iOS 5 yet, but people had an exploit where you could use Safari to go to a website. Once you went to the website, it would then download a piece of software that would break the system and allow you to install basically jailbreaking software onto the system. So it was a little roundy-bowdy. And I'm about to answer the question of why is it different? Because this is an important slide. This is really the fundamental difference. I'm going to show you props here, folks. iPhone, Android, iPhone. If we match it, so I'm holding them upright. Match the screen. There we go. Okay. The difference between these two things is architecture. And there's fundamental differences on a good side and a bad side. Looking at the first is the security model is very, very different. The security model for Android phones says that each application has its own security, and you can choose which security item you can turn on or off when you install the application. And so when you download the application, often the Android store will say it does things like accesses system memory, accesses your address book, accesses photos, that sort of thing. If you've used an Android phone, you've seen this before. The App Store, the iPhone, says you can only do stuff in your own little sandbox. I don't care what you want to do. That's all we're allowing you to do. So iPhone apps can't really access anything outside of outside of themselves, with the exception of a very limited number of programming interfaces. So that's a big difference. The iPhone is sandboxed. It can't talk to other apps. Makes it extremely inconvenient if you want to do things like build utilities. The Android system is far more powerful, gives you a lot more flexibility, allows you to tune your phone, but the price of that is you need to be aware of the exploits that are available to each application. So that means you've got free and open communications between the apps on the Android side, and you have essentially no communications between the apps unless you do something like dump a file on Dropbox and bring it back down later with another application. You have no communication between apps on the iPhone side. That means you also have this open distribution curated by Apple. We talked about open distribution in these secondary app stores. We really, other than the jailbroken side of the iPhone, we really don't see a secondary set of app stores for the iPhone where, for example, Amazon said, we don't want to let Google sell apps. Let's sell our own apps. And they opened up their own app store. Boom, done. You know, you're not seeing Amazon decide to sell iPhone apps because it won't work. So you have a level of freedom that is really high here. You can do pretty much whatever you want. You have a level of freedom that is pretty much not here. You can only do what, Uncle Steve and now Uncle Tim will allow you to do. Different architecture completely. The security reliance here is also really different. If you look at the reliance here, you are expected to know what you're doing. On the iPhone side, you are expected to be an infant and have no clue what you're doing. Now, I got to tell you, when you're talking about my elderly neighbor who's managed to download an incomprehensible number of viruses on his Windows machine, I'm more comfortable with something that watches over him. For someone who's technically inclined, you may want to have more control. Yes, sir. Oh, okay. Sorry. So you may want to have more control. So you have this relatively high malware incidence. We're not seeing anything like 1 million malware applications on this, unless you count iCloud as a piece of malware. We're not seeing anything resembling 1 million malware incidents on the iPhone. We're seeing them on here because of that free and open system. But there's an interesting trade-off. The interesting trade-off, and this is where my interview with Dell was very, very interesting, is that you can harden this thing. This is a platform. It is a platform that systems engineers can get into and muck with. Not only bad guys can get into it, but people doing real work can get into it, and they can change it up. They can install new systems, they can harden it, they can make it, they can verticalize it, they can limit its capabilities, and they can create a mil-spec device out of one of these things that they will never be able to do out of the iPhone because they don't have access to essentially replacing the operating system unless they jailbreak it and reverse engineer it. Essentially, the Android environment allows a vendor like Dell to build military spec devices using Android, where Apple, you can't. So you have a really interesting trade-off. I think if you're going to see these things in the field with actual government applications on them, they're almost exclusively going to be Android and not iOS. If you're going to see things where people want to have the easiest way to play Angry Birds, this could be on here. So that answers the Orlando question. And one of the last things I want to do here is talk about the security fix pattern, because this is really interesting as well. Basically, what happens is this is an HTC device from T-Mobile, and thank you T-Mobile for providing it for my testing uses. This is an HTC device, and if Google wants to make a security bug fix, they have to issue the fix. It then goes to the central Android group to be able to approve the fix, and then from that central Android group, it then has to go out to all the manufacturers, who then have to choose to ship it before it gets in individual users' hands. That's a bit of a time period challenge to get a security fix on Android into users' hands. Now, the contrast here is Apple has much more control over their supply chain and their distribution chain, so if they want to issue a fix, they just pump it down, except that one of my colleagues figured out that less than 50% of the users of iPhones and iPads actually plug it into the computer to get the updates. So although on one hand the argument could be made that it takes longer for Android to get updates onto the individual devices, the argument could be made that it doesn't really matter because most iPhone users won't do it anyway. This is the stuff you got to keep in mind when you're looking at Android security issues and what we're dealing with. So actually, before I go into mobile impact on IT, I'm going to take another moment for questions. Any questions before I move on to the next stage? And I'll fill the slide in while we do that. Yes, sir.
I have a question then. For the comment on the last slide, what about zero-day attacks? I mean, more and more we see zero-day attacks where basically the time frame has been compressed dramatically between the time the attack becoming known and an attack vector being used by somebody with a piece of malware. When will we see the same kind of response time in this market that we already see from security vendors in the PC market?
No, I'm going to tell you two sides to that story. First off, we are seeing that response time now on Google's side. But Google then has to get it through the whole chain of stuff before it gets to here. And you've got 100 manufacturers. And so you may have, and I'm just using names here, you may have HTC and Verizon do those fixes in an hour. You may have another vendor decide that it's going to wait until the next time it ships a new device. So you have that situation. But I'm going to tell you a secret about zero-day attacks. They are scary, but a much larger percentage of attacks come that are on systems that haven't been updated for years and years. So if you were to look at a chart, and I actually have a chart somewhere, it's not this one, and I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head, but the amount of impact of a zero-day attack is the amount of impact of an ancient attack that should have not been able to hit anybody's because people haven't updated their PDF reader, they haven't updated their Flash player, they haven't updated their operating system, they're still running IE6, those sorts of things. And the same thing applies to this. I mean, we've got a lot of Android phones that are stuck in older versions of the operating system that the vendors aren't going to upgrade because they want you to buy a new phone. And so, either the user isn't upgrading it or the vendor isn't upgrading it because really they want to churn these things once a year. You might churn them twice a year, but vendors, their business model is they'd really like to churn it yearly with something new and exciting and have you pay that penalty because that's really profitable to be able to churn these things around. And so there's less of an intent to do those kinds of updates on major updates, like going from, up to ice cream sandwich, for example, versus just getting people to buy a new phone. And to some degree, we're seeing this with Apple in that some of the older versions of the iPhones have now been abandoned in terms of updates as well. And to be fair, I mean, we're not seeing a whole lot of Windows 98 updates coming out of Microsoft either, so.
Another question from Orlando.
Yes.
They're asking, what can we as Android owners do to protect our phone infrastructures?
That is going to be the last part of the presentation. There's 10 excellent tips that'll help them out answering that. The question was, what can we as Android users do to protect our information infrastructures? And that's where we're going next. So perfect segue. Let's move on into that. So let's talk about a little bit about mobile's impact on IT. I mean, I've left this slide up here for a little while so you guys can have pretty much read it. But essentially, mobile impacts IT everywhere. It changes the game. You know, I mean, what's going on here is we're no longer, I mean, when I started, okay, now this is going to give you an idea of my age, but when I first learned my very first programming, it was on punch cards, okay? And I got in trouble when I worked at International Paper because I went to the punch card machine and I typed in my own little punch cards instead of using, to me, the old ladies that were downstairs who were probably in their 30s, but I was like 17. You know, and to let them punch the punch cards because they were the ones who would do the punch cards. So we'd write it on coding forms, and then we'd take our code down to the people downstairs, and then they would go in and they'd punch them in, and then we'd bring it back up, and it would go to the data center, and they'd schedule the deck to run, and a day or two later, you'd get back your printout and find out you had a bug, and it would cycle all over again. Okay, this was 1978. So that was the data center in 1978. You know, today we're talking about virtual machines, we're talking about cloud computing, we're talking about mobile people, we're talking about the ability to fling virtual images of servers from place to place. We're talking about being able to dynamically allocate load. We're talking about data pools. We're talking about a completely different architecture of computing that's changed in the last 4 or 5 years versus before. And mobile is a piece of it because mobile, to some degree, it means that the data center has to take the load. Because whenever you use a cloud computing device on here, a cloud computing piece of software on here, whether it's Dropbox, which I used today to get a copy of my presentation, which I didn't bother to bring with me, or whether it's, you know, Google Apps or any other tools you're using, we use a cloud computing program to keep track of our grocery list, okay? Each of the pieces of software that does that is relying on the data center to take on the load. At the same time, you're also having multiple connections that need to be secured going from individual employees all across wherever they happen to be to the data center. A classic example of that was I don't know if you guys read in the news a few months ago where they had thought a dam out west somewhere had been attacked through a denial of service attack from Russia. And they thought that, oh, this was one of the first examples of infrastructure being pummeled by the Russians in the US that had gotten through all the defenses because they traced an IP address that had gotten into the system to an IP address from Russia. Well, it turns out that they were having a systems problem there. They were actually having something was going wrong with their systems, and they called their systems engineer, who happened to be on vacation in Russia. And so he was on vacation in Russia, and he pulled out his little computer, and he did what systems engineers do across the world. They ruin their time to go help people. And, you know, so he pulled up his little computer and he connected into the system using all his appropriate connections across the VPN and everything else and fixed the little problem. Well, unbeknownst to him and unbeknownst to his management, other people started trying to figure out why there was this problem. They found the IP address in Russia and all heck broke loose. And so, you know, what IT operations are dealing with is this concept of wildly distributed problems that weren't that way before because, you know, not only do you have these devices, but you have the BYOD versions of this, which is bring your own device. You have the stuff the company issues. You have the stuff that happens to be on the computers. You have this incredible increase in complexity, but you also have an incredible increase in flexibility, like doing what we're doing today, which is broadcasting this stuff to Orlando and then simulcasting it out to other places. So there are the trade-offs. There's the trade-offs of, oh my, and then there's the trade-off of, oh my, you know, we can do all this stuff. One of those is figuring out which of these devices controls the thing. So another aspect of this is backing up your data. You know, now that we have these things, I have a neighbor who I am trying desperately to move off a Windows PC onto a tablet so that, again, they don't download every piece of malware on the known planet. And I'm trying to move that person, actually I'm trying to move that person onto an iPad, to be honest with you, because I think they can get in less trouble. And so what you've got is a situation now of this iPad. You know, my neighbor is irresponsible to begin with. Now he's got it on the iPad. Is he going to back up his iPad? No. He has to rely on some service in the system to do the backups for him. And so it's basically some hand-holding to do that. In the corporate world, we have the same thing. We have backups but we also have that data at large situation. So we have both of these things going on. As we look at it, we need to look at the questions of how do we make sure we're getting it, how do we make sure we're getting it securely, how do we make sure that it's not, you know, corrupted in between, how do we make sure that everything stays in sync. I mean, a great hands-on example of this problem is if you look at WhisperSync and the Kindle applications. You can actually kind of see how this works in a consumer environment, because if you, for example, have, I have a book I'm reading that's on my Kindle Fire that I also have that I'm reading on the iPhone. And when I'm done reading it on the iPhone, I want to pick it up and read it on the Kindle Fire, and I want it to be in exactly the same place. So that, in a sense, is backing up, because the book and the information and the status of that information has to go up to Amazon, into Amazon's amazing system, and then be pummeled back around to the rest of the place. So the other issue is what's in your walls, what are they bringing into your walls, and what are they bringing outside your walls. This is one of my pet peeves. This is one I don't think we're going to solve easily. But in particular, in a secured environment, how many of you folks work in a secured environment? A lot of you. Okay. I contend that if you work in a secure environment, you should not be allowed to cross the threshold with one of these devices, or a camera, or a thumb drive, or anything that holds data. Nobody listens to me in that regard. But because the threat is enormous. I mean, the Manning threat and the whole WikiLeaks thing and the State Department documents, actually, the guy took DVDs, brought them into work, and wrote the DVDs and left. You know, I mean, talk about old school. But meanwhile, you know, the potential of taking one of these things, plugging it into a computer behind the firewall, all of a sudden you're now behind the firewall with who knows what, a fully functional, I mean, Androids are fully functional Linux machines. You know, so you got yourself a fully functional Linux machine behind the firewall doing, again, who knows what. The threat and the potential is difficult. So what can they take in? What can they take out? What do you need to defend against? Remember how much can be stored on one of these things. You know, I talked about how many times over the WikiLeaks take could have been done on just, you know, this little tiny HTC device. You know, so what I recommend is make sure you develop secure encrypted tunnels and VPNs. Make sure you choose and recommend devices based on security availability. Don't listen to your crying employees. Do what's right for your organization. And make sure you really carefully install intrusion detection and prevention software inside your firewall. And that brings us to tips. So I'm going to stop here for 1 second, and then I'm going to go on to tips. Any questions before I hit the tips? Yes, sir. Virtual private network. A virtual private network is, well, okay, if I'm talking to you, you can hear me, right? Denise, can you do me a favor? Can you come here? Denise is my wife. She's going to help me out for just 1 second. Virtual private network. This is my virtual private network.
Hello.
Can you tell me on the fly? Okay. This gentleman right here. So you were just told a number. Now it traveled in a way that the public here couldn't see. Now I'm going to ask you to break that private network and tell me what that number was. 5. There you go. So what you saw was a private network. You saw the public network, meaning stuff traveling over the internet. And what I did is I just created a channel between me and you. You got the best of you get to talk to my wife. I just created a channel between me and you that only you and I knew that it traveled through. That is a virtual private network. It is essentially a networking channel that travels over a public terrain that gets to the other side where everybody else around it can't get through it. So there you go. Now I want to thank Tom Henderson of Extreme Labs. He is a towering expert on the issue of Android security. So I asked him to give me some enterprise level tips for you guys. Anything that's really brilliant is his, and anything that's not so brilliant is mine. So his first suggestion is mobile device management. And he talks about a lot about mobile device management, management security, putting management into practices, building mobile device management into your enterprise as an overall policy system. He talks about setting up whitelists and blacklists, being able to manage unapproved apps. So, you know, somebody comes into your system into your firewall with one of these things, plugs it in, and there's an unapproved app on it. It can pop up and let the IT managers know, or at worst go out and isolate the device and so forth. So that's an important step. Another one is to be able to look at the different types of mobile device management. And basically this is, who manages this? Does your carrier manage it? Does your IT operation manage it? For individuals, how do you manage it? Well, that's where you install malware, or you install a backup program that automatically backs up to your device. Who manages the ability to manage the device? But both of those tips relate to the thing of don't just use the device. You need to make sure you are managing it and managing it well. You're aware that these things are not just toys. They're things that essentially need to be checked out. Number 3 is to be able to enable remote wipe and kill. There's a TV show that took over a slot for another TV show I like that I'd really like to enable remote wipe and kill for, but anyway, the point of remote wipe and kill is that if a device is lost or stolen, you want to be able to have the device essentially self-destruct, Mission Impossible style, if it falls into the wrong hands. There are problems with remote wipe and kill, as you might imagine. There are problems like, is the device turned on? Okay, then it can do that. But if the device is actually hard tapped, if a card is pulled out of it or something else, you might not be able to actually do that. But remote wipe and kill can at least get you part of the way. It can, reduce the security problem a little bit. And when we think about security, think about it the way they did in the ancient times, where they had layers of security. They had the people standing on the parapets and they would shoot at you. And then they would have the door that would come down, and then they would have the moat filled with ick. You want to have different layers of security because not every layer is going to catch everything, but something like remote wipe and kill will catch some of it. And you want to build these layers of security on top of each other, so it's really, really hard to get through the whole process of it and cause damage. There is still a lot of damage caused, but again, you want to try to mitigate that as much as possible. There are some really neat kind of active sync features for Exchange, which is kind of interesting. If you use Exchange in Android, you can do some neat stuff to protect your data. Something people don't normally think, the reason I want to point that out is you don't normally think of a Microsoft enterprise product with Android and have them work together to do some neat security, but it actually is there. Number 4 is do not trust applications from the Google market. Remember I told you not to trust applications from everywhere else? Now I'm telling you not to trust applications from Google market. Be not trusting. Ronald Reagan said trust but verify. To some degree that's true, but also trust as little as possible. Because although there is some Q&A on the Android market, and generally speaking, if you're buying Angry Birds from the Android market, you're buying it from the people making Angry Birds, you still have a situation where this stuff isn't wildly verified. And while we're at it, don't necessarily trust everything on the App Store either. So for example, don't download an app that tells you that it wants you to give it your Google Mail address. Because then that app has your Google Mail address and you don't know where it's going. So that app may not be able to touch other apps on your system. It may not be able to go in and say, okay, well, I can get to your address book from here, or I can get to, your photos from here. But if you give it your Gmail address, you've given it your Gmail address. Yes, sir.
What about things as simple as a lot of apps want to activate location services?
Yeah, the gentleman asked, what about things about applications want to access location services? Well, that's an interesting question. Do you want to activate location services? I have location services off on most things on my phones. I have it off for 2 reasons. One is I really don't want people to find me most of the time. I write publicly, and you should see some of the comments. But secondarily, it sucks a lot of battery. So the more you turn off of location services, the longer your phone will last you. When I first turned on the iPhone and I turned on location services for everything on the phone, it had maybe a 4-hour life. Whereas when I turned off location services for virtually everything, it now lasts most of the day, kind of. So from a practical point of view, you want to turn it off. From a tracking point of view, I really don't want somebody, if I'm going to send a tweet about what I'm doing, and in my job, I kind of have to tweet, believe it or not. I'm 50 years old and I'm talking about tweeting. I don't want people to know exactly where I am all the time. I don't want people to know that I'm having a nice quiet dinner with my wife at whatever local restaurant. I don't want to tell them, oh, I'm at this restaurant, and I don't want to tell them what time it is or what the routes are I take and so forth. So I want to turn that off. Now, the problem is you may turn that off unless you're somebody who has to use Foursquare and you want to check in because you want your little Foursquare badge. At that point, you're a lost cause. It's just it. Do not root your phone. You know, I talked about flexibility, I talked about capability, but rooting your iPhone opens it up in one way. Rooting your Android phone means that your applications have access to everything, which means essentially it's the equivalent of Linux root. And you don't want to have a root on your Linux device either for the same reasons. Don't root your phone. Oh, and the bottom line on that one is, if you do, don't come crying to me or Tom. HTTPS is your friend. You know, if you're going to use a web browser, make sure you're using a secure web browser with a secure connection. I recommend, honestly, not to use a web browser on a phone unless you're on your local Wi-Fi and you're sure you have a protected local Wi-Fi. I recommend not using your web browser on your phone to go to any place dangerous anyway. Don't go to your bank on your phone. Don't go to your bank on your phone when you're staying at the Waldorf and using their open system. It's slow, it's crappy, and it's open. Don't do that. And this is the reason I use the Waldorf as an example is I stayed at the Waldorf a couple years ago when I did a History Channel thing, and I was there with the former head of Homeland Security, Chertoff, and with everybody's friend Newt Gingrich, among other people who were there for this program. And the thing is that all of these people, all of these luminaries were at this place, and it was an open Wi-Fi network. It was just open. You could just go in and links this connection, and boom, there you go. No security. So, all of these people might have decided they wanted to use Wi-Fi with an open network. Now, one would hope that the former head of Homeland Security would have a clue not to do that, and anybody who is an actual active government official staying at the Waldorf would have a clue not to do that. But we've met our politicians. So HTTPS is your friend. The other is Big Brother may be watching. Now this gentleman over here asked a question about OnStar and Big Brother, and let's define Big Brother for a second, okay? Big Brother could be the government of Bahrain, or it could be the government of China, or it could be the United States government, or it could be Google, okay? Big Brother. Anybody could be watching. But the key to this is I'm not telling you how to conduct your nefarious activities, but I am telling you that you may be subject if you're a doctor to HIPAA law, for example. And so if you're doing something on your phone and you're a doctor, you may not realize that you're potentially disclosing patient data, which is a no-no in terms of government regulations. You may not realize that you are subject to rules, regulations, and laws when you're using one of these things, even though you may be fully aware of it when you're in your office. So be aware that Big Brother is watching, and be aware that you are subject to whatever rules, regulations, and actions of law as a citizen and in your professional capacity. Check your logs regularly. This is one of the things that's interesting about Android, is that Android keeps logs about a lot of stuff, and it's homework, and it tells you a little about the security question of Android, in that if you have to go check your logs to see if anything bad has happened, it's a little bit more homework than you necessarily want for a phone. But it's not a bad idea. Check your logs regularly to see if anything weird has happened. And it's the same thing with your computer, with your network, with your router. It's not a bad idea to check your logs regularly and see if anything weird's going on. It's also not a bad idea, by the way, to check your bank statements or your credit card statements regularly to see if anything weird's going on. And we're just about out of here. I'm going to talk about resources in a minute. Number 9 is consider using 2 phones, personal phone, work phone. If you have an issue where you may have, like, for example, a HIPAA compliance issue, or you're doing certain things for work, it's a pain to carry 2 phones. But consider having one phone that you isolate for everything work-related and one phone that you download all your games to and do all your random family stuff with. It will keep it a little bit easier to keep track of what's going on. You may want to. It's a little costly. It could be a pain. But also you have the situation where then if your company is providing a phone and you have a phone, you know what has your information on it, you know what has your company information on it. Finally, number 10 is be aware when you install. Whenever you put an app on, and this is a little bit of a repetition of what I talked about earlier, is whenever you put something on your phone, be aware of it. Don't just go, okay, nice, okay, nice, okay, nice. That looks interesting. I want the latest thing that lets me shake it and give kaleidoscopic effects on it. Which is last night's free giveaway from Amazon. what you want is to be thoughtful about what you put on your phone, when you put on your phone. On one hand, if you put too much on it, you start to cruft it up and it becomes more difficult to manage, and it's just all this stuff that you have to eventually clean off. But secondarily, every one of these things could have an impact on both security and the functioning of your phone. More so on the Android side than the iPhone side, because any app you install could affect some of the other apps and their behavior. But again, use caution here. And I think, oh yeah, this brings us on to the last two slides, which is the future of what we think secure Android will be. Now, how many here understand what virtualization is? Okay, most of you. I'm going to talk about it briefly. Virtualization allows you to create an image of a computer in software. So, for example, I'll give you a good example. I'm doing development, and I'm moving from an old environment to a new environment. And the old environment won't run on Windows 7. It'll only run on Windows XP. But I don't want to have both a Windows 7 machine and a Windows XP machine on my desk. I want to have one machine. So virtualization, I have a little box that allows me to run Windows XP in a little piece of software on my desk, in a little virtual computer on my desktop in the Windows 7 environment. So it's an image of virtual computer inside the real computer. In the enterprise world, it's an enormous change to how we run data centers, because once you have a virtual image and you don't install the whole operating system onto the hardware, then, for example, if a piece of hardware fails, you can then take that entire running virtual server and pump it somewhere else. Or if it turns out that the data lines going into one area have been overloaded, or there's some kind of disaster to provide more capability, you can move these virtual images from place to place. They are essentially full computers implemented in software as opposed to computers implemented in hardware. And they run on top of the computers implemented in hardware. A good example of this, going way, way back. How many of you guys have used Macs? Way back is when Apple moved from the 68000 processor to their PowerPC processor, and again later when they moved to their newer stuff, to Intel, is they wanted all the old stuff to kind of work when they moved to the new one. So they simulated the old 68000 in the PowerPC. And that simulation meant that the software didn't know that it wasn't really running on a 68000 chip, it was just being fooled and told it was doing it. Essentially, virtualization is kind of, I don't even want to make this analogy, but roughly a cousin to phishing, in that you think you're on a website that's for Bank of America, but you're not. In this case, the computer thinks that all your software thinks it's running on a piece of hardware, but it's not. It's actually running in a fake. It's running in a holodeck, basically. I'll give you. So you're in a holodeck, and so you're able to take your software and run it in a holodeck. And what we're looking at about for the future of this, and Jason is a particular advocate of this, is we think that the future of Android phones will be virtualized kernels, where essentially the phone that you buy is a holodeck shell that then runs a virtualized version of Android inside it as a way to make sure that you're not having all of these different versions for all of these different phones for all of these different vendors, that you can just load the virtual image. Each vendor has its own holodeck, but runs the same holodeck software inside. So that's what we think is the future, and the benefits of this are huge. I mean, among other things, it then separates the software from the hardware. It allows the hardware to have a layer that does all sorts of levels of protection that the software never sees. It allows you to easily move your stuff from phone to phone. So, for example, if you're going from this phone to, say, a Razr, you don't have to necessarily lose everything. You can just move that virtual image from place to place. It gives you a lot more flexibility. So we think that's where it's going to go to. And finally, these are all the resources you can find. Where to find me, find these videos, find the downloads, find free information, just tons of free me stuff. So that is a deep dive into Android, and I'm opening up for questions once I take a sip of water here. Did I answer everybody's questions during the thing, or are we pretty well?
Actually,
go ahead.
You raised a great point at the end. I want to circle back with that point, back to the comment I made earlier about the 0 day and how quickly the vendors are responding to the pressure effectively to respond to security threats. When do you think this virtualization is going to occur, and will it give us an environment that looks more responsive to the malware?
The question is, when do we think this virtual environment will actually move into play, and will it give us an environment more responsive to malware? And by responsive to malware, I'm assuming you mean able to protect against malware as opposed to more open to. Yeah. I'll answer that backwards. I think this kind of environment can make us much more responsive to malware much quicker because one environment will be common across all of these different things. As to when it takes place, if you think about it, that's the pushback. You know, on one hand, you've got the question of does Google want to go in that direction in a productive way? Because remember, they just bought out Motorola, and so they have their own hardware. And so there's the whole issue of how is Google going to compete against the other hardware manufacturers. And the other hardware manufacturers all want to install their own uniquifying nature on top of these things, usually stuff that everybody doesn't want and wants to get rid of. But they want to uniquify their own version of things. And so there is from a technical point of view, we're seeing that actually coming about now. We're seeing builds of these things that have the capability to do that. I mean, it's not a technical hurdle. It is a political hurdle and a business marketing hurdle among these vendors. And I think it's going to really happen when this stuff becomes too hard to manage, that we're going to hit a point where, I mean, you saw the growth chart at the very beginning of this presentation about how fast this is growing. We're going to hit a point where it's easier for manufacturers to have a virtual image that they can manage than it is for them to have their own proprietary stuff. And we're going to hit that point, and I'm guessing at that curve, we're talking a year or so.
Do you think that vendors like VMware have an economic incentive to participate in the process at all?
Does VMware have an economic incentive to participate in it? Well, I mean, anything in Android is an economic incentive. I mean, you saw the size of this market. VMware, for those of you who don't know, VMware is one of the makers of one of the more Linux-friendly virtualization hyperkernels, the environment that runs virtual software. And they are also the people who brought you the ability to run PC stuff on your Mac, you know, things like that. Will they have an incentive? Absolutely, especially for like mil-spec kind of work. You know, I mean, in terms of for the consumer, it's going to be a while before there's a really valid incentive. But for custom and vertical market stuff, absolutely, because you know they want to be able to have these things work and maintain one code base across a variety of different systems. And I would contend that that incentive exists today. Yes, sir.
Another question from Orlando.
Hi, Orlando.
Any comments or observations about NSA's SE Android based on SE Linux?
Any questions about NSA's SE Android based on NSA's SE Linux? All right. I don't like SE Linux. As a website operator, I don't like SE Linux because nothing I try to run on Linux works when I have SE Linux running. SE Linux is the secure extensions to Linux. It is a brilliant way to secure Linux. It also means that nothing runs on a website once you're running SE Linux because it won't let you do anything. So it's great unless, of course, you want a forum to be able to record forum entries or anything else. And yes, you can go through and you can customize SE Linux to a very detailed level. So, you know, if you have months and months and months of your life or teams of engineers, you can go in and you can tweak SE Linux to make sure that it only allows certain things through and other things not. You know, as an individual website operator, I don't have that kind of time. You know, defense contractors do. And so, you know, as a person who doesn't have that kind of time, I've been bitten in the butt by SE Linux a few times. I'm not thrilled with it, although I like its security, and I've tried to implement its security because I'm a security guy. But from a corporate point of view, it has its uses. And I think in terms of the Android world, there's a similar kind of thing. You'd like to see it. But again, to support app stores or to support the ability to add apps, you can't have SE Linux doing all it wants to do, because or the Android version of it, because then you would want it to block adding new software to anything and running it, and it would be able to do that. So I think we're going to see this again in these hardened environments. You know, we're looking at these things not just as consumer devices, but really hardened mobile devices, and I think we're going to see it there and have a very useful use. Any other questions from the gallery?
If anyone online has questions, please type them in the chat block.
Yes, sir, in the back.
PCs, you know, we have security applications developed like Norton or McAfee or free ones like Clam or NAMD or whatever. What's available on Android or mobile devices? It's like we have a whole suite of security applications.
Actually, there's quite a few. The question was, what is there that's available on Android that's a suite of security applications? I mean, first off, McAfee is out there. There's a variety of other. Let me go back to the slide that has that, which is a few slides back. Maybe it's not. Maybe I didn't pull it. But McAfee has it. I used as a reference point early on a source here. Let's take a few minutes to dig through. Sorry, guys. There we go. Lookout. There's a piece of software called Lookout that is free that provides a full security suite. And I got a lot of interesting data from them because they were able to, and they're okay. They're not the best in the world, but they're pretty good. They were able to provide this information based on looking at the threats that their data was, that their malware system was tracking to be able to provide this. I'm going to zip back to the end. While I do that, are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
Any security software for the iPhone that you've had experience with?
Yes. The iPhone operating system. iOS. In all seriousness, they're really, I mean, if anybody is selling you at this point malware protection or antivirus protection for the iPhone, they're taking your money because there's nothing, that software too can't cross the boundary of the sandbox. So, you know, and
so it would have to come from Apple.
It would have to come from Apple, and I would, you know, to some degree that would either mean it would break your computer, your phone, or not, depending on whether they debug it well enough. But basically, yeah, at this point, if you see somebody selling antivirus software for the iPhone, it really can't do much. I mean, if you see it doing things like checking your Dropbox, that might be useful. You know, if you see it doing things like having access to things. But a lot of this stuff, the other thing I'm nervous about, this is one of my other pet peeves, is I don't like buying software from companies that aren't American. Now, to some degree, that is because I write the government column and I'm a political pundit and so forth. But I also get really nervous buying security software from somebody in someplace in Russia. Okay, it freaks me out when I get my security software from someplace in the middle of the People's Republic of China. Or, you know, the Belarusians are out there giving me my security software. There's something wrong about letting them safeguard me. It's the same thing as when we decided to let the Saudis safeguard our port after 9/11. I mean, they may be fine companies, but it's freaky, and I tend to like buy American. So, any other questions? Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Sure.
David, a small token of our appreciation.
I have a plaque.
And David, and Kusa gave you the plaque. We at ITEA had to give you something nice to carry home.
Oh,
All right.
thank you so much.
And also, thank you to those online. We had asked if you could please type into the chat section who you are and where you're from. So far, the most distant is White Marsh, Maryland. If there's anyone on who's further than that, please let us know.
All right. Also, sign-up sheet. If you haven't signed in, please do so locally here. In addition to thanking our speaker, David, thank you so much. Elizabeth, Sam, they're still working here trying to get all this stuff running.
And a hearty thank you to the University of Central Florida, second largest student populace in the country. We'll give you a free plug, and their business incubator program for broadcasting this.
Very good. Okay, thanks a lot. So that wraps it up. Come back next month, and we'll do glaze-based metrics. And just to show you that it is our February meeting. There's Puxatani Phil. Pronounce that correctly? Okay, my name is Joe Vanderbilt. I'm the president of the Space Coast chapter of INCOSE, International Council on Systems Engineering. So this is our February meeting, and it is a joint meeting that includes the ITEA, International Test and Evaluation Association, the Central Florida chapter. And so we held a joint meeting last year. It was very successful. We had a good time, and decided to do it again, and we're actually going to do it next month also. So it's a good chance for folks to kind of interact. Okay, let's see. We got a lot of people here. We've got the people scattered all over the place, I guess. So I'm not sure who all is where. So maybe if you don't mind, we'll kind of skip the introductions tonight and get right into the show here. So, okay, so a little bit about INCOSE. INCOSE is a nonprofit organization. It's a professional organization of system engineers. There are chapters. INCOSE has two publications that come out on a quarterly basis. One is called System Engineering, which is a peer-reviewed publication, has papers in. The other one is called Insight, which is a little bit more of a newsletter type format and has information about the different technical activities that are going on within INCOSE. So the different working groups and special interest groups kind of report their activities out there. INCOSE also has two major activities that go on each year. One is the System Engineering Symposium, which has presentations and tutorials and panels. The workshop, which actually just finished up a week ago, I guess, was actually up in Jacksonville, and that's kind of where the technical groups get together and kind of have a chance to sort of talk face to face. They also do the planning for the symposium, which is run in the middle of the year. Okay, INCOSE is organized by chapters, member-supported chapters, and there's about 60 of them in INCOSE, and there's 4 of them actually here in Florida. So there's our chapter, which is on Space Coast, Florida, the East Coast, sort of near the Kennedy Space Center, Brevard County. There's the Central Florida chapter, which is in St. Pete, Tampa area on the West Coast. There's the Orlando chapter, which is located in the Orlando area. And then there's one up in the Panhandle of Florida, the Emerald Coast chapter. So we've got quite a bit of representation here in the state of Florida. Okay, our chapter, as I mentioned, serves kind of this area, the central east coast of Florida. We've got close to 90 members. We've got a pretty stable membership. We basically make our meetings and everything available to anybody who's interested in system engineering. So we would like you to be a member, but if you are not a member, please come out, join us, and kind of share our activities with us. We just had elections last year. We installed the chapter officers, so this is the slate of officers, and most everybody is here tonight. Some items of interest that are coming up here. There's a couple of things that are happening out of the country so far. But in the middle of March, the System Engineering Research Center, this is actually hosted by Stevens Institute, will be in the St. Louis area. And then in May, we've got the Asia Pacific Conference, which is going to be in Australia. There's going to be a regional conference in the Washington, D.C. area in May. And then the symposium that I spoke of, which is INCOSE's kind of big event, is actually going to be in Rome this year. And so that'll be in the early part of July. Also, for the folks that are located here in the Space Coast area, we have something called the Canaveral Council of Technical Societies, and it is a group that is made up of all the different technical societies in the area, and INCOSE is a member of that group, along with a lot of other organizations. They put out an event calendar. I've got some copies over there, so if you want to see some of the things that are going on in this area, like tours of Kennedy Space Center, stuff like that. Our meeting is also advertised there, and other technical activities that are going on in the area. You can see that in the calendar. One of the things that CCTS has asked about is they're sort of polling the membership to see would folks be interested in trying to put on a robotics type competition. And this would basically tie into the FIRST robotics and the LEGO robotics, which is high school and middle school and lower school. So this basically where kids kind of get involved in robotics competitions. They put in a great deal of effort, and they have lots of teams, and then they go out and they compete. it's very expensive for them to go out and compete. And a lot of the teams put a lot of effort into their work, but they don't actually get on the road and compete. So we thought maybe this would be an opportunity to maybe sponsor a competition in the area where they don't have to travel so far. Those of you who have seen some of those robots, they get to be pretty large. They basically have to be, brought over in large vans. So we thought, well, maybe we ought to try to have a local competition, and then they can use that to kind of hone up their skills and at least have a chance to kind of showcase some of the work they're doing. And then, some of them will actually go on, to other forms of competition. So what they're looking for, I guess, is would there be some interest in this? And in the way of interest, certainly, donations of money is good. They're looking for the different societies within CCTS to help out there. But probably the main thing is just getting people to help support these teams, help put on the the competition and things like that. So anybody who's interested in that, you can give David Fleming, who basically is the president of CCTS now, or contact me and I'll get in touch with David. So anybody who's interested in having some fun and getting involved with kids in the local area, putting on robotics competition, just let us know and we'll see if we get enough people to actually make this happen. Okay, next meeting is going to be, let's see, 1st of March. Okay, Dr. Kelly Hale, who's over in the Orlando area, is going to give a presentation on advanced gaze-based performance metrics. Okay, and so this basically has to do with vision, right? So there's a lot of interaction between people and machines, where it's very important to understand where the human is looking to basically, bring out the right features in the scenario, for example. Okay, when I was going to college, we also had advanced gaze-based performance, but basically that was going to high school functions and seeing if there was somebody checking you out at the dance and stuff. This is a little more advanced. So you're welcome to come out and see that next month. A little update, last month, the presentation, and we had a really great presentation, great speaker. One of the topics, yeah, that was me. Okay, one of the topics we talked about was 3D printing, and we talked about printing musical instruments, printing interlocking ball-bearing raceways, whatever good that would be. Okay, well, here's something else. This actually came out about a week or two ago from Quality Digest. How about printing a house? Okay, so it's like an inkjet printer. Okay, the print head is a little bit larger. Okay, and it's actually, instead of spraying ink or maybe plastic at I don't know, about 10,000ths of a millimeter line width. Okay, this is spraying concrete with about a 1 or 2 inch line width. But same idea, basically a print head. Okay, concrete goes in, sprays the concrete down in a pattern. Okay, and by the time it gets back to make the second layer, the first layer has hardened enough that it'll support the weight of the subsequent layers. And they think they can print a house in a day. Okay, so what would you use this for? So you could use it for emergency shelters. Right now the disaster areas, they put up tents and and all these temporary buildings and stuff like that. They could actually build concrete structures, and so they think they can put up a 2-story house very quickly. And they said we may actually see something like this actually put buildings up on the moon maybe before we actually get them to put up buildings in third world countries. This whole thing breaks down, it loads on a flatbed truck, send it out to the site, they put it together, and they start building houses. Okay, there's a sign-up sheet going around here, so please sign in. If you're not a member and you're interested, there's some information on how to join INCOSE over on the other table. And with that, I will turn it over to David Groh to give you a little bit of information about ITEA. This one, right? Yeah, right.
Thank you, folks, and thank you, Joe. By the way, your speaker last month was great, and if he ever feels like coming to Orlando, we'd love to have you, Joe.
All right, good deal.
Real quick, my first lesson learned today was I made the mistake. Joe said, are you going to send me your slides for introduction? I said, why don't you send me yours? I'll just map them. This guy uses so many pretty pictures and animation. I apologize. I failed miserably. So, International Test and Evaluation Association, Central Florida chapter, so I represent, I'm the president of that organization. And what you're seeing in this graphic is we cover the entire peninsula region of Florida. We share the state with the Emerald Coast chapter, kind of like yours, sitting out there on that other pretty coast above the Gulf. We were established in 1980. We are an organization of professionals within test and evaluation as a discipline, also a not-for-profit. It's kind of interesting, if you compare the INCOSE and the ITEA goals, we're almost identical in our approach to helping things, helping education. And in fact, it's kind of funny, my organization teaches systems engineering, his teaches T&E. The overlap's incredible, and we've had a phenomenal partnership with INCOSE Orlando and INCOSE Space Coast, and couldn't be happier working with our partners, and have been working with INCOSE Orlando on some of the education, filling in the T&E part for them. Our membership, sorry Joe, we're cheap.
Yeah.
This is what ITEA looks like on an international basis. And if you ever wonder if there's creativity outside of this country, up in the top left is the ITEA logo. The United States featured very prominently. And when you bring the Australians in, these are very clever individuals down here in the bottom left. They turn the globe around, lifted up the banner, and prominently show Australia. So our vision, he recognizes the premier for test and evaluation, and our mission is to advance the field of T&E worldwide. And just as systems engineering will often be the foundation and the building blocks that are going into creating something, we're the people that find out if that worked, how well it worked, and the two organizations and our functions are very much hand in glove. He showed his officers, so I'm going to show mine. I'm the president. Henry Jahan is my vice president. Elizabeth Hood sitting here is our secretary and also secretary of INCOSE Orlando. Our treasurer is Juan Orozco, and our UCF liaison there, Carol Ann Dykes, is sitting there in Orlando for us, making sure we're connected to the rest of the world through the internet. And you're seeing the rest of our directors, and we're structured a little different. Our officers are elected by our membership. It's on an every 2-year basis. If our membership's below a certain level, it's an administrative decision whether or not to re-elect. And our directors are appointed by our officers and have no term limits. So we have a constant continuity, and we're all accountable to our members. ITEA Central Florida is also blessed. We are a tenant of the University of Central Florida's Business Incubation Program. That's who's streaming this to the web tonight, and we thank UCF BIP for doing that. Watching this, if you would, please type your name and your location. This is a test tonight. This is the first time we've done this, or UCF Business Incubator has, and we'd love to be able to say where we reached. So we really appreciate you identifying yourselves. One of the benefits of us being a tenant, the UCF Business Incubator clients are part of all of our functions. Our members are welcome to all of their functions. So we have a very good relationship there also. And we do attempt with them to put our venues together so that the small business community, as sponsored there, and they're very open to the entire region for small business, not just their clients, can come in and meet with our folks as well as we bring them in and get exposure to the larger companies, academia, and also the government itself. So we try to open those doors up, and we're very much getting into that this year. He had a groundhog picture. I had to try and top it. And as a Pennsylvania native, I have to ask this question as a New Floridian. If Phil saw a shadow today, does that mean we're condemned to another 6 weeks of 80-degree days? Pennsylvania, we didn't have that challenge. And Joe, I give it back to you and your Photoshop.
All right, thank you. Okay, so one of the folks who tries to come out to our chapter meetings whenever he has an opportunity, and he wasn't able to be here tonight. He's vacationing in Afghanistan, but he did respond to our invitation to come out. He couldn't make it, but he did send some pictures that are very recent, actually within the past few days. So a rocket basically penetrated the building he was in, You can see it went through one of the I-beams that's holding up the building, went through the wall, and apparently bounced off through the back side of the building. Apparently it did not explode. And that happened about 10 minutes before all the folks came back from dinner. So that's the kind of stuff he's having to deal with. And then to kind of lighten things up, he did send me a picture for all the people who are interested in supply. So that's from Joe Burko.